Hello and welcome. My name is Mark Horseman, Data Evangelist with DATAVERSITY. We would like to thank you for joining the current installment of the monthly DATAVERSITY webinar series, Real World Data Governance with Bob Seiner. Today, Bob's modus operandi using glossaries, dictionaries, and catalogs to drive data quality across the enterprise. Just a couple of points to get us started. Due to the large number of people that attend these sessions, you will be muted during the webinar. If you would like to chat with us or chat with each other, we certainly encourage you to do so. And just to note, the Zoom chat defaults to send to just the panelists, but you may absolutely switch that to network with everyone. For questions, we will be collecting them by the Q&A section. To find the chat and the Q&A panels, you'll see the icons for those features in the bottom middle of your screen. As always, we will send a follow-up email within a couple of business days containing links to the slides, a recording of this session, and any additional information requested throughout the webinar. Now, let me introduce to you our speaker for the series, my friend Bob Seiner. Bob is the president and principal of KIK Consulting and Educational Services and the publisher emeritus of the Data Administration newsletter, tdan.com. Bob was awarded the DAMA Professional Award for significant and demonstrable contributions to the data management industry. Bob specializes in non-invasive data governance, data stewardship, and metadata management solutions. And with that, I will give the floor to Bob to start his presentation. Hello and welcome, my
Hey,
friend.
Mark, can you hear me okay?
I sure can.
That is a good thing to do because I figured, after 15 or 20 minutes of silence, you might say, Bob, we can't hear you. Can you imagine what the mayhem would be or how uncontrollable it would be if everybody was off mute and had the opportunity to just kind of speak up and ask questions at the same time? That's really great. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate the introduction as always. Another great, very pertinent topic for today as we'll talk a little bit about how there was the great Dataversity conferences last week, the EDW and the DGIQ conference. And it seems like every presentation, well, of course, they're talking about AI and AI governance, but they all seem to also come back to talking about some of the tools of the trade for data governance practitioners. And those tools, and we talk about them a lot. Everybody seems to be talking about them a lot, are the business glossaries, the data dictionaries, and the data catalogs. And also, especially with the DGIQ focus, the information quality focus, a lot of people were talking about using these tools to drive data quality. So again, I don't know how we do it, but Shannon and I, as we're working on topics, we always seem to come up with ones that are really pertinent. And I saw through the chat that there's a lot of people that were already talking about some of the glossaries and dictionaries and catalogs that they have. So I hope the subject will be good to you. I hope it's timely for you as well. And it is very relevant, especially today, that we're talking about, let's see if I can get my screen to move here. We're talking about tools. What are the tools that are in your toolbox as a data governance practitioner or as a data quality practitioner? And I was telling Mark before the session, I'm having work done outside my house. And so I specifically asked them not to be banging on the walls with their tools outside my office from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock today. But again, if you looked out on my lawn right now, you'd see tools all over the place as they're doing some work on the outside of the house. But we're going to talk about tools today, and specifically the use of the glossaries and the dictionaries and the catalogs. Without further conversation about that, I'm just going to kind of lead into what we're going to talk about today. Before I get started, I always talk about some of the things that I'm involved in, and I'm involved in a lot of things, it seems to be. I also list about this data governance webinar series, Real World Data Governance, third Thursday of every month. Next month, another topic that seems to be really relevant in a lot of the organizations that I'm speaking to right now is data stewardship, and how is data stewardship changing and evolving, and what are some of the trends and innovations that are in the government sectors or in the public and private industry. So I think that's going to be a good subject to kind of dive into too, is where is data stewardship going? As we kind of reset the narrative around data governance, another topic for another day. We really need to rely on our stewards to help us to govern the data, because we as the practitioners can't do it all ourselves. We know that. I mentioned the Dataversity Enterprise Data World Conference and the DGIQ conference that took place last week in Anaheim, California. I'm very much looking forward to whenever the next Dataversity event will be there, because if you know me, you know I tend to show up and really enjoy those conferences. So I talked about data governance tools, templates, and techniques. And it's a similar subject to the glossaries, dictionaries, and catalogs, but I was really sharing in that session some tools that you can build yourself, and things that you don't need to rely on vendors to provide you some of those types of tools and templates. I talk a lot about non-invasive data governance. I've written a couple books. I've actually written 3 books now on the topic. The first one came out in 2014. It's been translated into several languages. I'm very honored and pleased that that has happened. But then in 2023, I had a follow-up to that book, which was Non-Invasive Data Governance Strikes Again, with the idea being that it had to have struck once in order for it to have struck again. And then the third book, as I'll show you here, it was published just a few months ago, and I'm proud to say that at the bookstore at the EDW DGIQ conference, the third book sold out in the bookstore. So it's good to know that people are interested in reading about how to unleash non-invasive data governance in your organizations, how to empower people to govern AI and data. I have several learning plans that are available through the DataVersity Training Center, so please check those out. The most recent one I did, although it's not real recent, had to focus on pretty much the same subject that we're going to talk about today, but with less of a data quality focus. And that one was focused on business glossaries, data dictionaries, and catalogs. The name of my consulting business is KIK Consulting and Educational Services. KIK stands for Knowledge is King, and I refer to that as the home of non-invasive data governance. And when I'm not busy doing all of these things, on the side, I am also an adjunct faculty member at Carnegie Mellon University here in my hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in their Chief Data and AI Officer program. So I'd love to talk to you about that if anybody has any interest in that program. Typically in the webinars, especially recently, I'm grabbing 4 pretty pertinent topics, I think, to go along with the subject of the webinar, and then I'd like to save some time at the end to walk through some examples of organizations that are using their business glossaries, or using their data dictionaries and their catalogs to really demonstrate value in their organizations. I'll talk a little bit about what they're focusing their attention of these tools on. But first, I'm just going to talk in general terms about the role of the glossary, the dictionary, and the data catalog in data governance. And if you looked at the vendors who were, there were a whole lot of vendors that were at the conference last week in Anaheim, but a lot of them were data catalog tool or metadata tool vendors that were focusing specifically on the data governance space and the enterprise data management space. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the role that glossaries, dictionaries, and catalogs play in data governance in general. Then I want to talk, a lot of organizations spend a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of effort to get these tools populated, to get these things ready to go for their organization, but there also still seems to be some struggles in getting these tools integrated into the work that people are doing across the organization. So I'm going to share some best practices, just a handful of best practices for integrating these tools into your enterprise. And then I'm going to bring the subject back around to data quality again, and I'm really going to focus mostly on standardization and talk about how can we use these tools, the glossary, dictionary, and catalog, to improve data quality through the standardization of data, having good solid quality standards for data, for at least the most critical of data across the organization. And then this seemed to be a topic of a lot of the presentations as well. At the conference last week, I was creating that common language for data management, getting people across the organization to use the same terminology, to understand the data in such a way that they know what data is the same, they know what's different, they know what the similarities and differences are. And then, like I said, I'm going to wrap up by sharing several examples from some real world data governance examples from some real world clients as to how they're using these tools to effectively move their programs forward. If you've attended these webinars in the past, and I'm guessing a bunch of you have, but some of you may be new to the webinar series, I always start with my definition of data governance and data stewardship. And some people will tell you that you have to hear things over and over again for them to really resonate with you. I know I'm that way. I need to hear something a few times before it kind of sticks with me. But I've even trimmed my definitions down, and I've made them very easy to explain. So data governance, I define it as the execution and enforcement of authority over data. It doesn't matter if you're taking a non-invasive approach that I like to talk about, or a command and control, or a traditional field of dreams kind of if you build it, they will come type of approach to data governance. At the end of the day, you need to be able to demonstrate to your organization that you're executing and enforcing authority over the data. A lot of it has to do with behavior change, getting people to change. So data governance, just the term governance is the execution and enforcement of authority, whether it's over data or over people or over other types of assets. So data governance, again, is the execution and enforcement of authority over data. I'm going to talk about stewards quite a bit in this session, and I refer to the idea that potentially everybody in the organization that has a relationship to the data, if they're being held accountable for what that relationship is, they're a steward of the data. A steward, by definition in the dictionary, is somebody who takes care of something for somebody else. Well, I guess you're probably not going to be surprised that the metadata is not going to govern itself either. So we're going to talk about stewardship in terms of engaging your data stewards, and the people in the organization that define, produce, and use the data, the decision makers at the subject matter level, getting them engaged in the process of, again, defining the appropriate metadata for your organization, producing it appropriately in a way that's going to be beneficial to the organization, and then getting people in the organization to use that metadata that we're focusing on. And I don't know if you can hear this, Mark, in the background, but they're still making noise right outside my window. So
Can't hear it at all, bud. You're doing good.
I hope that Zoom is doing some noise cancellation on that. Okay, so these are three pretty standard definitions, but come to the realization, everybody's come to the realization that you need to execute and enforce authority over the metadata for the metadata to be useful and beneficial to the organization. You need to execute and enforce authority. You need to define the rules, and the rules need to be followed. And we need people in the organization. As I said before, the metadata will not govern itself either. I say that a lot about the data. But the metadata will not magically appear in these tools the way that you need it to demonstrate value to the organization. A couple more definitions, actually 4 more definitions to share with you is, one thing that still surprises me these days is people tend to use the terms glossary, dictionary, and catalog not necessarily interchangeably, or some of them are used interchangeably, but I wanted to just provide some quick, hopefully strong, easy to comprehend definitions of these terms that I'm going to talk about today. So the business glossary is typically in most organizations made up of business terms. This is just terminology that's used across the business and the definition of what those terms are. And in many organizations, they will have a centralized list of business terms. They'll then rationalize those terms. I'll talk about rationalization here in a little bit, but it's a central place where there's just business terminology and the definitions that go with it. I know there are organizations that try to add more to their business glossary. The ones that are most successful with them are the ones that actually have a centralized list and get people across the organization to discuss and come up with, if we're going to call something, let's all be speaking from the same definition, instead of having multiple definitions for the same term. A data dictionary, at least to me, really refers to a set of pieces of data that are within a specific data resource. So I would say, for example, you've got a data warehouse, you've got a data dictionary for your data warehouse, you've got a data dictionary for your Salesforce entities or your CRM systems or any of the systems that you're using. But typically it's a detailed list that describes what the physical data looks like within a data resource. Now, I said it describes the technical structure, but it also describes the business attributes, the business definitions, even potentially, and again, I'll talk about this in a little bit as well, the acceptable values for specific pieces of data within specific systems. So we know that that same piece of data might reside in multiple systems, but have different acceptable values, or maybe even reuse and redefine different acceptable values for that data. So a dictionary gets to the point where it's data element specific. And most of the time, from at least from my experiences, I see that it is that an organization may have multiple data dictionaries, depending what they have data dictionaries for. Specific applications, the warehouse, analytic platforms, those types of things. But in many organizations, they'll stick to having one business glossary because they want to try to get to the point where they're all speaking the same language. And then the data catalog being the third of that trifecta of glossaries, dictionaries, and catalogs, that becomes the inventory, that it's not really beneficial to people unless it's searchable. So helping people to find the data that they need, getting them to understand the data better, to know where the data comes from, and have that high level of trust of the data that they're using to make decisions. So the glossaries, the dictionaries, and the catalogs are different things. In my mind, again, you can have a data catalog that within it has multiple data dictionaries, or maybe is just a central data dictionary. Like I said, I don't see that happen too often. The catalog can also house the business glossary as well. And then data quality, and this is a pretty standard definition. It's a measurement of how accurate, complete, consistent, usable the data is for use within your organization. So again, it's very important to understand that these things are different, but we're going to talk about each of them in terms of how can we use these things not only to drive data governance, but to drive data quality, and then hopefully leave some time at the end of the session to talk about, to answer any questions that you might have. And please submit your questions, as Mark had mentioned, through the Q&A. I love to answer questions even after the webinar is over and everybody has gone back to real life. They've gone back to the real world, so to speak. But please submit your questions and I'll be happy to get to them. All right, the first topic that I shared in my abstract was, let's talk about the role of glossaries, dictionaries, and catalogs in data governance in general. And there's several things that we want these tools to be able to do for our organization. So there's what is the role of these tools within our organization as we're implementing data governance? And I just shared 5 of them with you. I think that aligning the language, and I talked about the common business language across the organization to reduce the confusion. That's really important. So that's one of the things that we can use our glossaries, dictionaries, and catalogs to do. And then, data dictionaries are nice. Dictionaries are great tools to have, but unless they're mapped back to reality, it's not very beneficial to the business people, where that data exists on a report or in a database or in a system. They're building a query and they need to understand what this data element is versus that data element. Well, having a definition and mapping it to reality is really important. So I talked about the glossary and the aligning the language, the dictionary and the mapping the definitions. And then let's view the data catalog as that thing that connects all the dots between the pieces of data governance, the stewardship, the lineage, the quality, all those types of things. The catalog becomes the governance connector. Talk about using stewardship, enabling the stewards and making that metadata visible to people so they can use it. And then another role of these tools is to support policies and standards with structured metadata. And you'll notice that throughout this webinar, I'm really primarily talking about metadata for structured data. So data that's in your databases, in your tables, columns of data, rather than unstructured data like record management, content management, document management. That could be another subject, Mark. I think we should do another webinar potentially for, well, how do glossaries, dictionaries, and catalogs change depending on the types of data assets that we're governing. So the first role really of the glossary is to ensure that people across the organization are speaking the same language. And that requires collaboration. It requires cooperation between the people in the organization that know the organization best. So, one of the roles, again, is to align language to reduce that confusion across the organization and provide that shared terminology that ensures that everybody's speaking the same language. It helps to eliminate ambiguity. There's nothing I hear that executives and organizations hate more than getting reports with the same data on it, but they have different results. And that's because the data is different. The data is defined differently. The understanding of the people that generated those reports is different. So we need to look to eliminate ambiguity. And that's one of the things that a business glossary, truly one of the benefits, and certainly one of the roles that a business glossary plays in an organization. And as we do this, as we bring people from the business part, from quote unquote the business and quote unquote the technical parts of the organization together, and we get them to agree on terminology, that we're all talking on the same language, it really reduces communications. And ideally, in the long run, it's going to reduce the reporting errors, the errors in the reports or the understanding of the data in the reports. And again, the role of the glossary is to standardize terms, get people to know exactly what the data means, to what the terminology means first, before we go and we start jumping into the dictionary, which gets more technical, so to speak, but technical in business as well. But as I mentioned earlier, the glossary is typically the place where business terminology is stored. Okay, so another one of the roles of the glossary, dictionary, and catalogs in data governance is we need to, as I said before, map the definitions to the reality of where this data actually resides in the organization. I don't know anybody who reads a dictionary. Well, maybe some people who are extremely nerdy read the dictionary. I'm not one of those. I'm not a person that's going to go on Jeopardy and know dictionary definitions real well. But organizations also don't tend to open up their data dictionaries and start to look at them until they really need to apply them to something. They need to apply them to actual systems within the organization. So that linkage between the data elements and the names of the data elements and which domains or which glossary terms they're associated with. I've given webinars in the past, and I didn't include it in this webinar, but just to shows the relationship between a business glossary and a data dictionary. And it really, all of these tools, they start to become real when you can link them to something physical that people need to know about. So that's the technical reality. That's the connected to actual systems, linking glossary terms to the technical metadata. So that people can, so that business people who don't know the data inside out, like a lot of us do, or a lot of people in the organization do, they can start with subject areas of data. They can start with terminologies and get from domains to domains or subject areas of data to subdomains, down to what data exists associated with that subdomain. Where is the technical metadata so I can actually see what reports and what databases that data exists in. So mapping the definitions to the technical reality become a really important piece, a really important role of the dictionaries for the organization. Again, it's just a series of a list of pieces of data and what their definitions are. It may be beneficial to some, but I would think that if you asked your business community, when does it really become valuable? It's when they can then take those definitions in your dictionaries and link to things that are real to them, that are part of their job, that are embedded in the things that they do day to day. So I talked about the glossary for a little bit, the role of the glossary, the role of the dictionary. The data catalog, I think that most of the vendors would agree with this, that it becomes the central hub where all of your metadata is stored. And it could be metadata about your stewards. That's still data about data, but it's data about the people who have accountability for the data. You can also record, information about your metadata, your technical metadata, your business context. They all seem to come together in that central hub Otherwise, people would need to be going to disparate sources of metadata. The idea of the data catalog is that governance connector, bringing together, the glossaries, the dictionaries, the inventory of data that you have in your organization. The catalogs are there to make it easier for people to, and Mark, I think I'm going to start a new definition, a new abbreviation here, or a new acronym. It's find, understand, and use the data. And I've never seen the acronym FUU used. I've seen the abbreviation of that used, but I mean, I think that's what everybody's trying to do with their data catalogs, is to find the data that they need, to thoroughly understand that data and make it useful to them. So this is where you heard it first, the FUU acronym. That's what the data catalog, that's the role of the data catalog in data governance. And as you'll see, as we talk about data quality, it's also the role of the data catalog in helping people to improve the quality of data across the organization. The catalog brings visibility to stewardship and ownership. I try to stay away from the term owner because it implies really the exact opposite of what a steward is. A steward takes care of something for somebody else. An owner is, well, it's my data. Len Silverstein gave a great presentation, a great keynote at the conference last week. He talked about my data versus our data. Instead of data mining, MY, it's data oursing and working together. And that's really what some of these tools are focusing on, is getting you to get the people in the organization to have a better understanding of the data, to work together, to coordinate and cooperate and facilitate and work together to improve the overall understanding of the data in the organization. And I think this is the last role that I want to share with you now. Actually, I think I have one more, is to enable the stewardship through metadata visibility. So that when stewards, the people in your organization who define, produce, and use data, if they're being held accountable for how they define, use, and produce data, or define, produce, and use data, when they have access to rich metadata, they can manage their data more effectively. And not only that, I'll talk about in a couple of minutes about how you can engage the stewards, get them activated, and give them responsibilities around metadata, but they're going to need to understand the value of the metadata to them. So enabling the stewards through metadata visibility, when the stewards have access to rich metadata and they have the context that they need, it's going to help them to do their job easier and with less questions. So actually, one of the things that I've found from many organizations is that once you empower the stewards with the metadata the way that I'm talking about, they truly become your advocates for data governance across the organization, and they become the advocates for the tool use as well. And by word of mouth, that's one of the best ways to share and get these types of tools used across the organization, where somebody talks about the value that it brings to them. And then the last role of the glossaries, dictionaries, and catalogs, and I know there's a lot of data catalog tools that do this now, is they give you the ability to import your policies and your standards into your data catalog tool. So it supports these policies and the standards with the structured metadata that's now being collected within the tool. So it provides the framework needed to enforce governance policies. In a couple of minutes, I'll talk about data tagging for data quality. It helps you to link specific policies to specific data within your organization. And that's really beneficial when the auditors come in to say, how well are you enforcing these policies? Well, we're tagging things in our repository so that the people in the organization know what data is associated with each of the different policies. So again, this is one of the big roles of the glossaries, dictionaries, and catalogs, especially working together, is to support your organization that are defining policies, defining standards, specifically around data quality. So again, I hope these were meaningful roles that these tools can play, but I'm sure that there's many others. Feel free to enter them into the chat if you'd like, or ask questions about them if there's other roles, other things that you're using these tools to do within your organization. All right, I'm going to need to speed up a little bit because I'm running probably running a little bit behind. let's talk about the best practices. Now, once we've made these efforts to get the metadata into our business glossaries and into our data dictionaries and into our data catalogs, again, that central hub where people can access the metadata, what are some of the best practices that we can follow to integrate these tools into, or to get them to be used across the organization? And I'll share with you some examples of some things I did way back when I was in the corporate world to just help to make some of these tools more beneficial and useful to organizations. So one of those best practices is to embed the glossary access where people live, where they work, so they don't have to jump out of an application, go into another application to get their terminology. Another, and I'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. Another one is to make certain that our dictionaries are synchronized with our source systems. And when I was in the corporate world, there were people in the organization that would challenge the metadata program that I was working on. Say, hey, we made a change to this system yesterday. Is that reflected in the repository? Or how long does it take for that to get reflected? And they were amazed. And again, I'll talk about automated change management and how important it is to keep those dictionaries synchronized with the source systems and the ETL the way it's taking place. Establishing a metadata onboarding workflow. I talked about integrating data catalog tags with data quality rules. Again, these are ways to take these tools and actually get people to start depending on them, or get them people to understand the value that's going to come from them and see the value so that they can share to the wealth with people across the organization. It's hard enough to get your organization to commit to putting money into the tools. It's another thing to get those tools off the shelf and get them into the hands of users. So let's talk about these best practices here real quickly. And if you notice, if you're friends with me or you're connected to me on LinkedIn and you see that I'm writing a lot about data governance and non-invasive data governance, I keep talking about how we need to meet people where they work. We need to go what tools they're using. And even back years ago, there were reporting tools that allowed you to provide a metadata resource along with the tools so that people could hover over fields and get definitions of those fields, get where they came from, get the acceptable values. So what we need to do is we need to embed the glossary, we need to embed the dictionary into the business applications that people are working with. And I think more and more, some of these tools, these great software tools that are being made available on the market, they have this capability. We just need to inquire, how can we deliver our specific metadata where people are working so they don't have to jump out of a tool and into another tool to get to the metadata that they need to do their job. So embedding glossary access, embedding dictionary access into the business applications is certainly a best practice. I talked about the importance of synchronizing and change management and making certain that when things change in your physical environment, there's not too much of a lag or delay before the dictionaries and the source dictionaries are back in sync with the source systems. And the ETL process is changing, or there's a problem with the data, somebody adjusts the ETL process. Well, that also needs to be reflected in your data catalog tool. So the data dictionaries are really most powerful to the organization when they reflect the current state. And that even includes when things have changed, because things are constantly changing within the current state. Make certain that you have an automated change process to assure that your dictionaries and your catalogs are current with what your present environment looks like. There's a lot more to be said about that, but it's just make certain that you don't provide people a snapshot of how your data looked in the year 2022, because it may not look anything like that in 2025, and it may not look like anything like that in June of 2025 versus May of 2025. Just keep these things synchronized. Building metadata usage into the workflows for new projects. That is certainly a best practice. I know I've learned this from experience, that if data isn't documented right out of the gate as a project is taking place, there's very rarely that effort to go, oh, we got to go back and document that data. Well, no, I'm sorry, we got this new development effort that we're going to focus on. It seems like going back and retrofitting metadata with your actual data doesn't happen as often as we'd like to see it happen. So we need to establish a way to onboard the metadata workflow into new projects. So start with a new initiative, start by defining and capturing key metadata. Having a structured onboarding ensures that the metadata is going to be consistent. It ensures that the data is going to be consistent, and it reduces technical debt later. Also as part of this process, you can start to recognize, instead of assigning people as stewards, let's recognize who in the organization has the knowledge to help you to fill out that metadata and recognize those people, and then record their information within these tools as well. Another best practice, and I mentioned it earlier, is to use these tools, or even if you're creating your own glossaries and dictionaries, create tags for them. Create tags that will help you to trace certain pieces of data and trace certain pieces of metadata through your systems. So take advantage of the tagging capabilities. Did I just say tagging? The tagging capabilities within your tool set, and link it to the quality rules, link it to the policies that are being used within your organization. So you said this rule for this specific data is because we have a policy that says the data needs to be this way. Again, take advantage. It's a best practice for getting these tools to be used across the organization, is to leverage the tagging capabilities that come along in your data quality tools and in your metadata management or your data catalog tools. And the last best practice I want to share with you is, use these tools as a way to bring governance into the equation. People recognize they need the metadata, they need to understand the metadata. We need to then kind of align these responsibilities, these things that the catalog can do, with somebody in the organization. And as I said earlier, the metadata will not govern itself. Somebody needs to be accountable for defining what metadata is going to be useful to the organization. Somebody's responsible for producing that metadata or getting it from somewhere, and somebody is certainly responsible for using that metadata. So we should use, it's again, a best practice for these tools is to use it to incorporate our metadata, our data governance roles, and get people activated to keep these metadata assets up to date. All right, so let's come back and let's talk a little bit about data quality through standardization, and what are some of the ways that we can improve data quality through standardization. And I'm going to go through some of these quickly because I want to get through all the slides here in the next 12 or 15 minutes, so we leave time for questions. Some of the ways to improve quality through standardization is to align the business terms across departments. We talked about that a little bit at the beginning of the session. Is to eliminate these conflicting definitions, eliminate the confusion, using standard definitions to reduce input errors and rework. There's ways that you can use things that are recorded in your data quality standards to limit the incorrect entry of data into systems. And we should certainly be considering that, because again, if we can address a quality problem up front rather than trying to resolve it somewhere down the line, it's going to be a lot less expensive to solve it up front. It's been proven to be less expensive to solve it up front than to try to trace it through your systems and see where the data quality issues have persisted. Implementing reference data and allowable values. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. Use those reference values, or those reference data and allowable values, to assure that the data is being entered consistently. Use the data catalog to identify and correct redundant or outdated sources. If you don't have an inventory of your data and you don't know where data is coming from, it's hard to be able to tell what sources are feeding what other sources within the organization. It's really all depending on word of mouth. So let's kind of walk through these ways to improve quality through standardization. The first one is to, as we mentioned earlier, aligning the business terms across departments, where there's conflicting metrics that the same data appears on and the reports are showing different results. We can use the terminology, we can use the standards, we can use the definitions, we can use the allowable values to help us to align and kind of reduce or eliminate those conflicting metrics and report and the confusion that's associated with some of the reporting that's coming out of our organization. It's a way to ensure consistent meaning, to support clearer collaboration, bringing people across your organization to work together on the metadata. Again, they've got to see the value that this brings to them before they're going to want to start participating in these efforts. But one of the ideas, one of the ways to improve quality is through the standardization of data elements and the standard understanding of those pieces of data and the valid values and those things that are being used to fill or complete those pieces of data. I mentioned that, having this specific metadata in our data definitions within our data dictionaries, we can really reduce inaccurate or incomplete or inconsistent data by taking advantage of this metadata, these things that are written into our standards, and actually activating them so that you can't enter. All right, somebody's entering a nursing home. You don't want them to be born in 2023 or 2024. Again, there's rules associated with the data that you can define within your data standards that can help you to highlight those things that, you maybe don't want to enter 010101 as somebody's birth date. I had heard somewhere at one of these conferences somewhere along the line that more people are born on either 12/31/99 or 01/01/01 than any other date. That's because that's the default. We can solve data quality problems. We can do it up front where the data is being entered, at least some of the time. And where there's that capability, we should think about using our standard data definitions to help to reduce those input errors and the rework. This is kind of along the same lines, implementing the reference data and the allowable values, again, restricting the input of the data to minimize any variations or errors in the data. It's very hard to do that if you don't have a dictionary, if you don't have a glossary, if you don't have a catalog where you can mark these things as being as being important or critical to the organization. And then using the metadata that we collect, activating it, taking it out of the spreadsheets, taking it out of the catalog, and using it as a tool to help us to improve data quality right at the beginning of where the data is being entered. All right, let's look at another way to improve data quality is using your data catalog to identify and correct redundant or outdated sources. So a lot of organizations, I'll talk about one here in a minute, where they're merging with other organizations. They're trying to figure out which data, which systems to keep, which systems are being used. Unless you have an inventory of all the different data assets and data, or just like I say, an inventory of the systems and the data sources within your organization, it's going to be difficult to, as this says here, to shine a light on any of these resources that are being underused or unused or they're duplicate, because you'll be able to see where's the ETL coming from. So having a data catalog, again, a way to improve quality is let's get rid of those systems, or let's reduce the importance of these systems that may be on their last leg or should be they're being considered for retirement. So again, another way to improve data quality is to know what data assets we have, know how they're related, and get rid of those redundant or outdated sources wherever we can. And the last way I wanted to share with you to improve data quality through standardization is to take advantage of the stewards. Recognizing the ownership of specific terms and formats. Again, I don't like to use the term owners. I would rather say the stewardship of specific terms and formats, enforce consistency and accuracy across the data lifecycle. These are, again, additional ways that you can use these tools to improve quality, but it all kind of starts and ends with the standardization. And we can engage our stewards and our domain stewards and our subject matter experts in the process of getting these things defined and resolving any discrepancies between these things. The last subject I want to talk to before I leave a few minutes to just kind of run through the case studies are the thing I started at the beginning with. When we talk about glossaries and the confusion around the data, is creating a common language for data management, creating a common language for business management. So we're going to start by, again, looking at the differences between a glossary, dictionary, and catalog. Won't spend a whole lot of time on that. Talk about facilitating collaboration using these tools, eliminating ambiguity, establishing naming conventions. Boy, that takes me back to my first job in data management, where it was Bob's job to name the data elements. But just having a naming convention is going to help people to speak the same language and be able to access and query and find the data that they need to do whatever they're trying to do. So the first thing is, again, the differences, and I want to reiterate this. I mentioned this as being important before. The business glossary defines the business terms, but it does it in such a way that everybody can understand. It's not just for the technical users and the technical audience. The data dictionary takes it to another level of depth. It starts to define the specific data elements within a data resource or a database or even a report. Excuse me, includes things such as field names, data types, formats. Again, it's different from the terminology, but oftentimes organizations through their data catalogs connect their glossaries and their dictionaries. The data catalog itself is, again, that asset, the asset inventory that we talked about, including who's responsible for the data, where did the data come from, the usage of the data, the definitions, the valid values, all of those types of things can be housed in a single place. And a data catalog would be, at least it feels like, is the logical place to store this information. So understanding the differences and then not using them interchangeably will help people in your organization to also understand how these things are different. Facilitates collaboration. You can use these, you can create a common language by facilitating collaboration using these tools. You get people in the organization to work together. By having these conversations, it eliminates the confusion between departments. If we can get them to agree on the language that we're using across the organization, having a shared vocabulary strengthens the ability of people to work together, and that collaboration and cooperation I spoke about earlier. Having consistent terminology wherever there are misunderstandings or the same data is being used different ways across the organization, having these tools, having that common language prevents the misunderstandings, and it really supports some of these major activities taking place in your organization that have to do with analytics and reporting. And then the cross-functional teams, well, they work together when they're speaking the same language. I think that's common sense for most organizations. I talked about eliminating ambiguity in reporting by getting people to work together and preventing you from having multiple interpretations of the same data. When people start to view the dashboards and the KPIs and the decisions that are being made across the organization, when these are built on trusted data, it builds trust in the dashboards. People will look at the dashboards with the metadata to support it, to understand where the data came from, how these dashboards are being calculated, how these KPIs are being calculated, and how decisions are being made. So really, these eliminate ambiguity by explaining what the data means, and everybody understands and uses the data the same way, then the organization is going to be in much more harmony than the disparate use of data that already exists within organizations. I don't want to spend too much time talking about the naming conventions, although I do want to touch on it. Back in the early days, my involvement in the industry, it was always, we had context, we had modifiers, we had class words, and we named data elements the same way. And in fact, I built an application that I called the DAM app, DAMM, a data administration management metadata tool that actually people could enter in business names for fields of data, and it would go look to the abbreviation library and come back and give them the appropriate abbreviation and the appropriate length for whatever data resource they needed that physical name for. It also worked the same in reverse, where people could enter in the physical names of data elements and see what is the business interpretation of those abbreviations that are being used in those names. So establishing naming conventions that kind of bridge together the technical and the non-technical people in the organization. That's a main goal for many of us in organizations today. And then engaging stakeholders to validate, this is the way to have these tools, is to engage people in the use of these tools, in the definition of the metadata, in the production of the metadata, in the usage of the metadata. It's the way that it's where many organizations are struggling right now. They've defined data governance programs, but they're trying to get over that hurdle of engaging the stakeholders appropriately. And not only do these tools, the glossary, dictionary, and catalog, help to create a common language, they also, it's a foot in the door to start to engage these people who are defining, producing, and using data across the organization. And potentially that could be anybody. All right, Mark, I know we're at 10:02, but I'm just going to go through these quickly and then see if we have any questions today. I just want to run through several examples of organizations that are using these tools and to help with their governance, to help with their data quality in the organization. So one organization standardized metrics using these tools, one clarified data definitions, streamlined system integration. Let me walk through each of these quickly and then turn it back to you, Mark. So the first one is with a retail organization, a convenience store chain. They had a lot of discrepancies in the ways that even the stores or the regions were reporting information. And they used their glossary to kind of resolve any discrepancies in the metrics that were being used, in the definitions of the fields that were being used, how they were being collected even within the stores. So they used a business glossary within a retail organization to just kind of resolve some of these reporting metrics and these KPIs. They couldn't have really done it unless they had thorough definitions and terminology and had a catalog that they could work from. A second organization is a bank that I was working with fairly recently, that they ended up acquiring a lot of different banks, and they had compliance issues and they needed to match up data across systems. So they had conflicting definitions, obviously, because the organizations that were acquired by the higher level bank hadn't worked together. They had things that were defined differently in different organizations, in the different parts of the organization that were now being merged together. They used these tools to clarify the conflicting definitions, specifically in the reports that were being reported to the government. In a manufacturing company, I'm working with a global manufacturing company that is merging with another company that's exactly the same size. And there was a decent data governance program in one organizations. The other really didn't have a whole lot for metadata. So they even started there before the acquisition took place, before they brought them together, so that they could have the metadata recorded that would enable them to identify overlapping assets across the organization. Another organization, a legal organization, a law firm, they were trying to drive accountability through the use of metadata within the organizations. So they made it clear, they documented who was responsible for what. And in a lot of that data, it was not only structured data, but it was unstructured data. Law firms work still in a lot of unstructured data as well, but it helped them to document who was responsible for what in terms of data assets across the organization. It ensured accountability. Again, I don't want to read all of these to you, but metadata and the use of the glossary, dictionary, and catalog were key for these organizations to implement governance, because it really made the metadata, the information about the data, that context relevant and available to people. Another one is to improve audit readiness and get organizations ready. This was a credit card company that was using tagging, and I mentioned tagging in the session, to help them to really highlight that specific data that was appropriately governed and managed per certain policies within the organization. If they hadn't collected that original metadata up front, they would not have had the capability to do that. I know, Mark, I kind of sped through these last five real quickly, just to very quickly summarize what I've talked about here. We started out by talking about the role of these tools in the organization, best practices for taking these tools off the shelf and making them available to people. We kind of brought it back to data quality, and we talked about standardization and how you can use these tools to improve standardization and thus quality. Talked about the importance of common language, and then just real quickly, ran through some success stories. In the time we have remaining, Mark, are there any questions for today?
We probably have enough questions, Bob, for 2 more webinars. We could probably do Q&A for another 2 hours. There's so many fantastic questions. There's so many fantastic debates that happened in Q&A. This is probably the most energized I've seen chat in like a year plus. So good
Wow.
job, everybody, for being so engaged, and
I
we'll
hope
see
they
how
weren't
many
all
we get to.
I hope they weren't all disagreeing with me. So let's
Uh,
get to it.
so and this is the most I generally do by most upvoted questions, and this is one of our favorite questions, Bob. Well, I think tools are great. Often orgs want a tool before understanding or having a foundational data governance presence. I think this is a huge mistake and can be costly and cause rework. Would enjoy your thoughts on this. What
Well,
do you think, Bob?
I think it's something like the chicken and the egg thing. Which one do we need first? Do we really need to have a tool? I would say, at least from my experience, that if you're going to acquire a data catalog tool, for example, it's going to take time in your organization. So you're going to need to assess the tools on the market. You're going to need to evaluate them, pick the one that's appropriate for your organization. But while that all is happening, there are things that organizations can do to be consistently collecting metadata that at some point can be ported into your data catalog. So don't start your data dictionaries after you have a data catalog tool. Don't start your business glossaries after you have a data catalog. You probably have some of these already within your organization. You're already starting to manage and to govern your metadata, but do it more consistently, do it more intentionally. And then at the right point, when you do bring a catalog tool in, that you have it ready to be incorporated into the product. I think that's how I would answer that question. There's not a definitive answer of which comes first. It really all depends on the organization.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Bob. And having gone down that road several times, how do I know what I want the tool to do until I know how the organization is going to read stuff? So it always kind of changes my evaluation of a tool after we've got something cooking.
Yeah, but there's something else too, though. So those organizations that already have tools
Hmm.
truly understand what the functionality of those tools are before you go saying, oh, this tool is not going to do for us what we need it to do. Most of the data catalog tools on the market provide very similar, simple functionality. How
Yep.
well they do it and the way that they do it may be different from tool to tool. But I mean, if you have a tool, use them. Use spreadsheets. Use
Hmm.
SharePoint. Use whatever you have access to until you're ready to buy a tool.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks, Bob.
That's why I'm here.
What is one approach we can use to fill out a data catalog for all the data sets in an organization? Should we meet with different departments one by one, or should we focus on domain subject areas and meet with the teams responsible for those areas?
Well, I think you need to do a combination of both. What I would do is I would start by having an idea as to what information you want to include within your inventory of data assets. And is a spreadsheet an asset, a data asset? Well, it may be very critical to the decision making within a part of the organization. So I would say, yeah, it may be an unofficial or shadow IT or shadow AI type of a solution, but it becomes an important data asset. Well, you don't have all the same attributes about a spreadsheet as you do about a system and a database. And with tables, you do have columns and things like that within a spreadsheet. I would say, I would start with an inventory first and then start to use that and if you do your due diligence up front before you meet with any of those stakeholders and you show this is what I know about your organization, it'll be instead of starting with a blank slate, you'll be starting with something that people can say, no, we don't use that system anymore. We use these systems now. I've replaced this with that. So I think it has to be both. I think we need to do the inventory, but we need to talk to the people.
Mhm. And then one question that we had a lot of debate on, I think this will be the last one we have time for. A properly defined third normal form data model should be able to cover the functionality of glossaries, dictionaries, and catalogs. Um, um, do you agree with that statement?
In a perfect world, maybe. And so perfectly, well, I have to go back to my third normal form days and my data modeling days. I think you're going to find a lot of the most important metadata for your organization within data modeling tools. The better that you model your data through these tools, if you keep it to strict third normal form, then the chances are you're going to have it down to the appropriate entities and attributes to start entering good definitions for it. So I think that I don't know if it replaces it, but I think that that is another one of those resources or one of those sources that are going to fill your data catalog is going to be what are the entities, the attributes, the definitions, the keys, all those things that are in your logical and physical models.
Awesome. And that is all we have time for. So thank you, everybody. And thank you, chat, and everybody who asked wonderful questions for the excellent discussion. And thank you, Bob, so much for this presentation. I hope everybody has a wonderful day. Thanks again.
And I told them to hold off on the banging until 3 o'clock, and it's now 3:01 and they're banging again. So thanks, everybody. Really enjoyed it. If you have questions, please reach out.
Thanks, everybody.